So I'm going to cover the homework from Chapter 5. This is Public Spending and Consumer Choice. This is about externalities and common resources. We start off with number 1. In this video I plan to do numbers 1 and 2. Many people who do not smoke cigars are bothered by the odor of cigar smoke. If private contracting is impossible, will too many or too few cigars be produced and consumed? Taking all costs into account, is the market price of cigars too high or too low? First thing I have to say about this question is usually for an externality to exist, it has to be something more than a person is bothered by something. It has to be some real cost. Um, I don't think we are much interested in imposing policy just because something bothers someone because I think we could find that someone is bothered by everything. So to answer this question, I'll go ahead and model the market for cigars. So here we are looking at the free market price and quantity of cigars that are being bought and sold at that price. Quantity supply equal to quantity demanded. And notice here we have just two parties, the sellers and the consumers. Let's say that cigar smoke is damaging to other people's health. There's some real cost to it. But those costs aren't part of this model anywhere. See, the supply curve, in micro we explore this in great depth, what makes the supply curve. The supply curve is a function of the costs of production for the firms to make the cigars. So that curve, if demand, let me put it this way, if demand rises, the quantity supplied will go up because people who weren't making cigars before will be tempted to do so by the higher price they can get due to higher demand, right? Well, that means they stop making what they were doing before to make cigars. So that's opportunity costs for them to enter that market. Or if it's not new entrants into the market, if it's the existing cigar producers, they are going to have to hire more laborers to go find more tobacco in the fields or to work longer at the plants where they wrap the tobacco with the wrappers and all the things that go into production. Those are the real costs of production. And the supply curve is upward sloping because if they can get more prices, they'll produce more because they are getting paid those additional costs for those additional costs with the higher price they can get. So the cost curve, the supply curve, is representative of the cost it takes to produce something. And those are all private costs borne by the firms that are making cigars. But if there's another cost not in the picture, such as secondhand smoke damage, that just means that that cost is being borne by some other party, not that it doesn't exist. So if we apply that cost to this market, if we were to do that, we would be raising the costs to producing cigars if we could somehow apply that cost. Well, if you think back to our determinants of supply and demand, one determinant of supply was input prices. So if effectively we could say people bearing, without any intervention, people are bearing a cost of this two-party transaction that's not here, we're going to take that cost that society is bearing and we're going to impose it on this market. We're going to have the sellers pay that cost. It would be just like raising input prices. And if we raised input prices, that would decrease supply, right? Remember that from supply and demand? Well, if we decrease supply, that is a left shift of supply. This is a decrease in supply, I promise. Might look like an increase, you're falling for a Jedi mind trick. It moved this way. So if we were to factor in all the costs of this two-party transaction of people buying and selling cigars, the real cost curve that we should be thinking about would be back here. And then that's why we call this the social cost curve. Now, to confuse the issue with shifting supply right and left, if we wanted to do that with policy, we could tax those sellers exactly that amount, and that would vertically lift this. It's still a decrease because it's a movement that way, but it would vertically lift this by the height of the tax. So if we could find this exact amount of damage that cigarettes are doing, we could charge that amount in a tax, and then shift right back to the social cost curve. And that would get us to what's called the optimum quantity of cigars bought and sold. And if you're thinking, well, cigars are bad, there is no optimum quantity, it should be zero. Well, that would be if we could figure out what the costs are to society and factor in those costs, not more than those costs, just those costs. That's the thing that makes this so challenging, I think, to understand, is that we know that people who are opponents to cigars would estimate those costs to be very, very high. People who like cigars would estimate those costs to be non-existent, or they might even argue that cigars are somehow good. And that's what's just so challenging. We're saying that if we could find what those costs are and treat those costs just like the cost of rolling paper, it would raise input prices, and we would factor that into this market, and then we would have a lesser quantity, which is part of the specific things we're asked for here, right? The last part is taking all costs, italicized in the question, into account. Is the market price of cigars too high or too low? I'm sorry, the second to last thing. Too many or too few cigars being produced. In the free market, too many are being produced. Q prime was too much because the optimal amount is here. Then the second part of the question was in the free market, which I have in purple, the original model, is the market price too high or too low? The market price is too low. The market price should be here, because this price would be compensating the makers of cigars for what they do, as well as the amount that society is being cost by the production of what the cigar makers do. So that would be the optimal price, and it would be higher than the free market price. So the free market price is too low. I think I can just leave my model on there for this next question. Let's see. Suppose that repeated application of a pesticide used on orange trees, this is number 2. Suppose that a repeated application of a pesticide used on orange trees causes harmful contamination of groundwater. The pesticide is applied annually in almost all the orange groves throughout the world. Most orange growers regard the pesticide as a key input to the production of oranges. Letter A. I believe there's an outright typing error in this question. It says use a diagram of the market for, it says pesticides. I think they mean oranges. Let me impose that word, okay? I'll come back. Use a diagram of the market for oranges to illustrate the implications of a failure for orange producers' costs to reflect the social costs of groundwater contamination. So the oranges are what we're interested in here, not the pesticide, because of what the author prefaced the question with, was that most orange growers regard the pesticide as a key input to the production of oranges. In the discussion videos, I mentioned if we could attack the pesticide directly, that would be ideal. But he said most orange growers regard the pesticide as a key input to the production of oranges. So that's why I really think he has a typing error in here, and he's referring to the market for oranges. The drawing will look the same, but the meaning is slightly different, and I do not think that word means what you think it means, to quote The Princess Bride. I think he means oranges, not pesticide. So anyway, let's use the diagram to reflect the social costs of that groundwater contamination. Well, that's easy for me to do. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my little towel, if I can get my stuff to say where I put it, and I'm going to scribble out, wipe out the word cigars, and I'm going to write the word oranges. And the image would look like that. So what we're saying here is that the price of oranges should be higher because people near where oranges are being produced are being adversely affected by this groundwater contamination, and they're not being compensated for it in any way. So if they were to be compensated for it, that would be a cost in the production of oranges, since the pesticide is regarded as something essential in this production. Okay, so this is what A should look like. The optimal quantity of oranges would be less, but the price of oranges should be higher. That says P opt right there. That's not my neatest handwriting ever, but that says P opt. And then letter B says, use your diagram to explain a government policy that might be effective in achieving the amount of orange production that fully reflects all social costs. Well, the easiest approach to this is just to tax oranges. Of course, nobody wants to tax oranges because oranges are a healthy thing overall, right? But the easy thing to do is to tax oranges, and you tax oranges by exactly that height right there, because that would, I'm talking about taxing, it doesn't really matter if you tax the consumers or the sellers, but the easy way to visualize this is tax the sellers, because then it's supply that shifts. You just tax the sellers, say for every orange you produce, you need to pay that much to the government. That would shift supply vertically by exactly that much, and you would achieve the social cost curve. The government, this is a little above and beyond the scope of the question, the government would then be able to raise this much in revenue. This rectangle, this would be the height of the tax right here. This orange height would be the height of the tax, times this many oranges, the optimal amount, being bought and sold, and this rectangle right here would all be government revenue. And then that revenue could be used to try to make the people who are being affected by the contaminated groundwater whole. So that would be how we would approach this. That's called a Pigovian tax. You could also do something like tradable permits for the production of oranges or something like that. But the most direct way is the Pigovian tax, just levy it on the sellers. Now, going back to his typing error about pesticide, if you could tax oranges that are produced with the pesticide, but not oranges that are not produced with the pesticide, that would be more desirable still. But there's no way that was included in the phrasing of this question. That's why I think it was a typing error, because that would incentivize shifting from pesticide oranges to non-pesticide oranges in that kind of production. But I don't think that's really what the author meant. I think I'm overanalyzing this question. So let me just make sure I answered it to get you by in my lab. Use your diagram to explain a government policy that might be effective in achieving the amount of orange production that fully reflects all social costs. Tax it. Tax it by the amount of the social cost. And that should get you through numbers 1 and 2.